It was an unusually cold day in Brooklyn Heights. The wind bit through the crowded streets, sharp and unforgiving, making my breath form clouds in the air. People rushed by, wrapped in thick coats, their hurried footsteps echoing on the pavement. The hustle of the city felt even more frantic than usual, as the chill seemed to push everyone along. But there was something about the way President Trump moved through the crowd that caught my attention. He walked with purpose, his gait steady and confident, his eyes scanning the surroundings as though searching for something or someone important. It wasn't the kind of day you'd expect a figure like him to stroll around in the midst of a bustling city. The air was brisk, and the chill seemed to settle into your bones, urging you to hurry along and find shelter. But there he was, in a simple dark overcoat, the kind of look that made him blend in while also somehow standing out, his security detail trailing behind him, keeping their distance but still vigilant. The familiar presence of power and caution hung in the air, as the crowd seemed to part just enough to let him move through without drawing too much attention. As he walked, people didn't rush to take photos or crowd around, but there was a palpable sense of curiosity that followed his every move. For a moment, he appeared almost like a shadow among them, an out-of-place figure who was there but not really noticed, almost like he had become a part of the landscape. The streets of Brooklyn, with their mix of history and modern life, were not the place you would expect someone of his stature to take a casual stroll. But there he was, his presence both comforting and disconcerting in its unpredictability. Then, without warning, he stopped. Right in the middle of the sidewalk, he paused, scanning the area again with an air of someone making a decision. His eyes flickered toward a narrow alleyway on the right, hidden in the shadows of the towering buildings. For a brief second, it was as though the world around him froze. People still moving, cars passing, but there was a sudden focus on the direction he was about to take. And then he turned. Turning down that alley, I instinctively followed. It was a reflex, a mixture of curiosity and the strange pull of a moment that felt too significant to ignore. What could he possibly be doing here in this part of Brooklyn at this hour? I asked myself. The question lingered in my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. There was a magnetic force in the way he moved, an enigma that demanded exploration. As we turned the corner, the narrow alley swallowed us, the hustle of the main streets fading into a haunting quiet. And that's when I saw it, the scene that would change everything. At the end of the alley, I noticed her. A woman, huddled against the cold. Her coat barely enough to protect her from the biting winter chill. She stood there in the dim light, the grayness of the day casting long shadows over her figure. Her eyes, though weary, still held a spark, something that suggested she had once known better days. Beside her, a cardboard sign read, "Veteran in need of help." The message was simple, but the desperation in her posture spoke volumes. The street was quiet in this corner, the usual clamor of Brooklyn Heights muffled by the towering walls of nearby buildings. She stood there, out of place in the shadows, but there was something about her presence that was different from the others begging on the streets. She wasn't just another figure lost in the blur of the city's desperation. She had the demeanor of someone who had once held strength, but had long since been forgotten by the world. Her posture was stiff, but not from pride, more from the weight of years gone by, of battles fought and lost, of promises broken. My eyes lingered on her as President Donald Trump walked past, his steps steady, but his pace slowing as he neared her. I thought for a moment that he might ignore her, like most of us tend to do in the face of such overwhelming need. It's easy to look away when the world's problems feel so big, so impossible to fix. But Donald Trump didn't. Instead, he paused, his gaze softening as he approached her. His security detail was still a few paces behind, watching carefully, but not intervening. For a fleeting moment, there was a stillness in the air, like time had momentarily suspended itself. I could hear the faint rustle of wind through the alley, the only sound in a city that never truly stops. Trump looked down at the woman, his face unreadable, but his eyes filled with something unexpected. Compassion, or at least a kind of recognition of her suffering. He took a slow, deliberate step closer, his usually imposing presence suddenly grounded in the quiet of that moment. The woman looked up at him, her expression cautious, uncertain if this would be yet another person who would walk past without a second thought. But Donald Trump didn't walk away. He crouched down slightly, his voice low but clear as he spoke to her. I couldn't hear the words from where I stood, but the scene before me felt more intimate than any public speech or rally. It was a stark contrast to the image of him that so many people knew, a man of power, wealth, and influence. But here, in this narrow alley, he was just another person standing before someone who had fallen through the cracks. The moment was brief, but it was enough to make me wonder if the man who had built his entire career on boldness, on making deals and shaping outcomes, was capable of a different kind of action, one rooted in humanity rather than politics. As the conversation seemed to end, Trump reached into his pocket and handed her something. It wasn't much, I assumed, but it was something. As he stood up, the brief exchange left an impression on me that I couldn't quite shake. Without a word, Donald Trump turned and walked back toward the main street, his security detail falling into step behind him. But the woman remained there, her cardboard sign still held in her hands, though her shoulders seemed a little less burdened than before. In that moment, the world outside the alley seemed to fade, as though all that mattered was the brief human connection between two people, one a powerful figure, the other a forgotten soul, who, for a moment, saw each other as equals in their shared experience of the cold, unyielding world. The moment was surreal. President Donald Trump, the very figure who had been the subject of so many headlines, controversies, and political battles, was now crouching down in front of a homeless woman in an alley. His usually commanding presence, the kind that filled rooms and dominated the stage, was now replaced by something softer, more grounded. His posture, usually stiff and assertive, was now one of quiet humility, bending slightly as he looked at her. The chill of the air, the sharp winter winds that had bitten through Brooklyn Heights just moments earlier, seemed to dissipate in that brief instant. Even the noise of the city, so relentless and constant, felt muted, as though the world had paused just for them. His voice, typically firm and forceful, now carried an air of calm that contrasted with the storm of images and words that followed him in the media. It was steady, genuine. "What's your name?" he asked, his words not tinged with authority or expectation, but with a simple desire to know her, to truly see her. His voice seemed to soften the chill in the air, providing a fleeting warmth against the bitter cold. "Emily Carter," she replied, her voice rough, like someone who had been shouting into the wind for too long, or perhaps just someone who had lived too long without being truly heard. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty as they met his, a mix of skepticism and curiosity, an unwillingness to trust, perhaps, but also a faint glimmer of something else, something rare in a world that had long overlooked her. She studied his face, as though trying to reconcile the man who had been so publicly divisive with the one now crouching before her, offering the simple decency of a conversation. "I served," she continued, her voice a little more composed now, as though the act of speaking her truth had momentarily steadied her. "Marine Corps, Afghanistan." There was a weight in her words, a story behind them that ran deeper than anyone would ever truly understand without hearing the full account. It wasn't just a statement about her past. It was a declaration of who she once was, someone who had fought for something larger than herself, who had stood in the face of danger, someone who had been trained to be strong, resilient, and proud. The pride, though, was buried beneath layers of hardship and neglect, each layer adding weight to her already heavy shoulders. Donald Trump didn't look away. He didn't move as though searching for a way out of the conversation, as many would have. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on her, absorbing her words with the same focus he gave to any high-stakes negotiation or rally. There was no dismissal in his gaze, no judgment, just a quiet attentiveness, as though he understood that this moment was not about power or politics, but about a person who had been ignored for far too long. "Thank you for your service," President Donald Trump said, his tone soft but sincere. It was a simple phrase, but one that carried the weight of years of sacrifice, both his own and hers. His hands remained at his sides, and for a moment it felt as though the distance between them, the space between the powerful and the powerless, had narrowed just a little. Emily Carter seemed taken aback by his words, as though she had expected something else, perhaps a dismissal or a hurried attempt to leave. Instead, she held his gaze for a few seconds longer, as though searching for some hidden agenda beneath his words. But there was nothing, just a man who, in this fleeting moment, had taken the time to acknowledge her humanity. I didn't expect that," Emily said, her voice trembling now, not from the cold, but from the weight of feeling seen. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't just a nameless face on a street corner, or an unfortunate statistic. She was Emily Carter, a person who mattered. Donald Trump didn't respond right away. He stood up, slowly, as though the exchange had taken something out of him as well, though I couldn't tell what. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a few bills. They were crisp, new, the kind of money that people with power and influence always seem to have in excess. He extended the money toward her, but not with the usual pomp or pride. This wasn't a photo op or a staged moment for the cameras. This was him simply offering help, the kind of help he could give in this situation, with no fanfare. Emily hesitated, eyeing the money in his hand, but after a long pause, she took it, her hands shaking slightly as they closed around the bills. She looked up at him, her eyes now full of gratitude, and something else. Perhaps the belief that this moment, no matter how brief, had given her something she had lost: hope. As President Donald Trump turned to walk back toward the main street, his security detail moving into place behind him, the world around them seemed to exhale. The bustling city resumed, the noise of Brooklyn Heights returning, but the scene in that alley stayed with me, the brief connection. The exchange of words between two very different people felt like an unexpected reminder of what it meant to be human. In that alley, at that moment, there were no titles or labels, just two people acknowledging each other's existence in a world that often moved too fast to notice. At that, something changed in Donald Trump's expression. It was subtle, but I could see it clearly. His usually steely, confident face faltered for just a brief moment, the ever-present bravado giving way to something else, a fleeting recognition, perhaps even regret. I watched closely as his gaze shifted, narrowing slightly, and his brow furrowed for just a second, as though he was processing the weight of her words. Then, almost as if speaking to himself, his voice broke the silence again, quieter now, tinged with something I hadn't expected. "Bravo, company," he muttered, the name rolling off his tongue with an air of familiarity. "I know that name. Phantom Squad." His eyes flickered, as if the mention of those words sparked something deep within him, a memory he hadn't expected to resurface. For a split second, there was a tense silence between them. Emily's face tightened, the stoic mask she'd worn slipping slightly as a flicker of something passed through her expression. Surprise, recognition, and then something else. Perhaps a touch of vulnerability? Then, without hesitation, she nodded. "Yes, sir, that was us." It hit me then. This wasn't just any homeless veteran. Emily Carter wasn't a nameless face with a cardboard sign. She was part of something far greater, something that very few knew about. I could see it in her eyes now, the weight of the past, the ghosts that still lingered. Emily wasn't just a former Marine. She was part of a legendary squad, a group of elite Marines who had been involved in one of the most successful and covert operations in the history of the war. Bravo Company's mission, known only to a handful of people, had been classified for years. The details of what they had done, the lives they had saved, and the lives they had taken remained hidden from the public eye. It was a mission so secret that only a few military insiders even knew its true scope. To most, their story was a mere footnote in the broader narrative of the war, a quick mention in a report or a passing reference in a history book. But to those who had been there, to the men and women who had bled and sacrificed for it, it was everything. It was survival, it was purpose, and it was the very reason some of them, like Emily, had been cast aside and forgotten by the country they fought to protect. Trump's voice softened, almost in awe, as he spoke again, his words carrying a rare level of sincerity. "You achieved the impossible," he said, his tone quieter now, as though he was finally realizing the gravity of the woman in front of him. "The things you did, they should have been celebrated. You should never have ended up here." There was a vulnerability in his voice I hadn't expected to hear, a rare crack in the armor that had made Donald Trump the figure he was. For once, there was no political agenda, no need to boast about his achievements or defend his reputation. In that moment, he was just a man who understood the depth of sacrifice and the heavy toll of service. I could see Emily's expression shift, as though the recognition, the acknowledgement of her and her squad's efforts was something she had long given up hope of receiving. Her face softened, but only for a moment. It was as though she hadn't realized just how much the validation of her actions, her unit's actions, would mean. But there was also pain in her eyes, a resignation that the world had already moved on, that she and those like her had been left behind in the wake of wars and policies that no longer cared for the soldiers who had given everything. She didn't respond immediately, perhaps unsure of how to take the compliment or the acknowledgement. Instead, she just looked down for a moment, as though taking a breath, processing the weight of what had just been said. For me, watching this exchange was like witnessing two worlds collide, the one of power and politics, the one of forgotten warriors. In that alley, the cold seemed to retreat, as if the unspoken understanding between Trump and Emily had created an invisible warmth between them. Emily wasn't just a woman on the street. She was a hero, a Marine who had earned her place in history, and for the first time in a long while, it seemed like someone important, had truly seen her for who she was. Trump stood a little taller, his gaze now more focused. "I'm sorry," he added, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "I don't know how this country could forget you, but maybe I can help change that." The words hung in the air, and though they were simple, they carried a weight of their own. There was a promise, an unspoken resolve to do something more than just acknowledge her past. Whether it would ever lead to anything concrete was uncertain, but in that moment, it was enough to make her believe, even if only for a fleeting second, that she wasn't invisible anymore. As he turned to leave, Emily remained in the alley, her face a complex mixture of gratitude, disbelief, and pain. The world around her hadn't changed in an instant, but in that brief conversation, something inside her had shifted, as though she had been reminded of her worth. And, in the end, maybe that's all anyone really needs. To be reminded that they matter, even when the world has forgotten. At that moment, I understood. This wasn't just some random encounter, some fleeting brush with a public figure. No, this was something far more profound. Donald Trump had recognized something in Emily, something that transcended the typical dynamics of power and politics. There was a deeper connection at play here, one rooted in understanding, perhaps even empathy. He wasn't simply walking by, trying to move past the discomfort of the moment. No, he was offering her something far more valuable, a lifeline. "Come with me, Emily," he said, his tone now markedly different. It was no longer commanding or authoritative, as one might expect from the former president, but rather a quiet, resolute promise. The words hung in the air, each syllable carrying weight and sincerity. "You don't belong here. We'll take care of you." The sincerity in his voice was impossible to ignore. In that moment, it was clear to me that Trump wasn't just offering money or a quick solution. He was offering something far more precious. His belief that she deserved better, that her past, her sacrifices, should count for something. The tone of his words was full of intent, not just for the present, but for the future. It wasn't a transactional gesture, but a genuine offer of help, a commitment to make things right. I watched closely as Emily, still standing in the cold of the alley, hesitated for only a brief moment. Her eyes flickered, searching his face for something, perhaps doubt, perhaps sincerity, but in the depths of his gaze, there was no calculation, no political agenda. There was only an offer of change, of a path forward that she could grasp if she chose. The weight of her decision was clear, and yet she didn't falter long. Slowly, almost as though testing the ground beneath her, she stood up. Her movements were deliberate, cautious, but there was a sense of purpose now, a quiet resolve in the way she straightened herself, as if for the first time in a long while she was standing not as someone who had been left behind, but as someone with the potential to move forward. She was no longer just a face in the crowd, one of many overlooked and forgotten. She wasn't just another homeless veteran or another casualty of the system. She was Emily Carter, a woman who had served her country with honor, who had endured the hardest of battles, and who now, perhaps, was being offered the chance to rebuild her life. She was someone who mattered, and now, someone who was going to be seen. For the first time in a long while, it seemed as though the world had decided to stop and pay attention to her. The years of struggle, the months of living in the shadows, the nights spent wondering if she would ever find her way out of the darkness, it all felt like it could be over. With a final glance at Trump, Emily took a tentative step forward. It was small, almost hesitant, but it was the first step towards something new. The weight of the past was still there, heavy and present, but it seemed less daunting now. There was a sense of hope, of possibility. Maybe she hadn't been forgotten after all. Maybe there was still a future for her, a future where she wasn't invisible. As she took that first step, I could see the transformation happening. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't dramatic, but it was there. The way she moved was different now, as if she had caught a glimpse of something she hadn't seen in years, a chance to rebuild, to reclaim what had been lost. Emily wasn't just walking out of that alley. She was walking toward a future she had long since stopped believing was possible. And as they walked together, Trump by her side, I realized that this wasn't just a simple act of kindness. It was a turning point, not just for Emily, but for everyone who had ever felt abandoned, forgotten, or unseen. In a world so often defined by division and distance, this was a moment where someone had chosen to step across that divide, to offer a hand without expectation of anything in return. And for the first time, Emily Carter had the chance to be more than just a survivor of circumstance. She had the chance to become a person who would no longer be defined by her struggles, but by the strength it took to rise above them. The next few days passed in a blur, a whirlwind of change that Emily could hardly process. Her life, which had been defined by the uncertainty of the streets, suddenly took a different turn. Emily, shaken but grateful, was taken under Donald Trump's wing. She was given a place to stay in a quiet hotel far removed from the cold, unforgiving streets of Brooklyn. The warmth and safety of her new surroundings were a welcome relief. But it wasn't just the comfort that mattered. It was the promise of something more. For the first time in years, Emily felt a flicker of hope, something she hadn't dared to feel in a long time. There was the promise of a future, a chance to rebuild, to find her place again in a world that had moved on without her. She wasn't just being sheltered from the cold. She was being given an opportunity to rewrite her story. It was a second chance, something she hadn't even known she could hope for. The days that followed were a mix of quiet moments and busy preparations. There were meetings, arrangements, and unfamiliar faces, people who seemed to be concerned not with what Emily had lost, but with what she could gain now. It was overwhelming, but in the midst of it all, there was a sense of clarity that emerged for her. She wasn't being treated like a charity case. She was being treated with dignity, as though she were not only worthy of a new life, but capable of living it. Then came the day of the White House ceremony, the moment that would mark the official recognition of Emily's service and the contribution of Bravo Company to the history of the war. Emily stood beside President Donald Trump, her expression still reserved, but there was something different about her. Her posture, once slouched and weary, was now a little taller. She held herself with a quiet dignity, as though something inside her had shifted, perhaps the realization that her past had not defined her, and that her future was in her hands. She wore the simple yet dignified clothes of a guest of honor, a stark contrast to the ragged attire she had worn only days before. The clothes didn't matter as much as the change they symbolized. The fact that she was being seen, not as the woman on the street, but as someone whose past mattered, whose sacrifices mattered. And in her eyes, there was a quiet sense of pride, a pride that hadn't existed for years, perhaps even since her time in the Marine Corps. As the cameras flashed and the crowds cheered, I couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. Just days ago, Emily had been a woman on the streets of Brooklyn, invisible to the world, struggling to survive. She had been a face among many, her story unheard, her sacrifices forgotten. And now, here she was, standing before the world, recognized, honored. The change was almost too dramatic to comprehend, yet there it was. This once forgotten woman was now being celebrated in front of an audience that included not only those who had once ignored her, but those who could now see her for the hero she was. Trump turned to face the audience, his voice ringing out across the room, strong and confident, yet somehow carrying a weight of reverence for the woman standing beside him. "Today, we honor Emily Carter and the members of Bravo Company," he said, his words echoing in the grand hall. "Their sacrifice, their courage, it will never be forgotten." The words reverberated in the air, not just as a recognition of the past, but as a commitment to ensuring that it would not be erased. The applause that followed was thunderous, the crowd rising in appreciation not only for Emily, but for the entire Bravo Company. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily wasn't just a bystander in her own life. She was the center of it, her story being told, her service being acknowledged, her sacrifices being honored. I watched her in that moment, standing proudly, her eyes scanning the crowd as though taking in the enormity of what was happening. She had been a Marine, a warrior, but now she was something more, a symbol of resilience, of survival, and of the possibility of redemption. The weight of her past, the hardships she had endured, hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined her. Instead, Emily Carter was being defined by her strength, by her courage, and by the incredible journey that had brought her here. It was a moment I would never forget, a moment where everything changed for one woman, and where the world saw her for the first time in the light she had always deserved. In that room, in the heart of the nation's capital, Emily was no longer invisible. She was a hero, and her story was being told. The applause filled the room, echoing through the vast, opulent space. But for Emily, it was more than just recognition. It was validation. The sound of the clapping hands was like a chorus, a reflection of the world finally waking up to her existence, to her worth. For years, Emily had been lost in the shuffle, a forgotten hero whose story had been buried under the weight of bureaucracy, ignored by a society that had no place for those who had given so much and yet had nothing left to show for it. Today, however, she wasn't just another nameless face in the crowd. She was being celebrated, not just as a veteran, but as a symbol of what it means to be overlooked, cast aside, and forgotten by the very country she had fought for. I watched her as she stood there, the weight of the moment sinking in. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out to accept the medal, the symbol of her service, her sacrifice, her courage. Her expression was a mix of disbelief and awe, as if she still couldn't quite comprehend that this was happening to her. The applause surged, and I could see her blinking rapidly, as though trying to clear the fog of years of hardship from her mind. This wasn't just the moment. She was being given a medal. It was the moment her entire journey, all the pain and loss, was being acknowledged. It was recognition of everything she had endured, everything she had overcome. Her eyes shimmered, and I knew then that it wasn't just the medal she was receiving. It was something far deeper, far more profound. This was the acknowledgement of her entire life, the years spent in service, the battles fought both overseas and at home, and the silence that had followed her return to civilian life. It wasn't just a piece of metal she held in her hand. It was the culmination of all the sacrifices, both seen and unseen, that had shaped her into who she was. It was the world finally opening its eyes to the weight of her experiences, to the unseen battles that had been fought quietly in the corners of forgotten places. As she stood there, her chest rising and falling with a steady breath, I could see the shift happening inside her. She wasn't just Emily Carter, the homeless woman on the streets of Brooklyn. She wasn't just the veteran whose story had been buried in the shadows. She was someone who had endured the unthinkable and had made it through. This moment, this celebration, was the world's way of telling her that it hadn't forgotten her, that her story mattered. The crowd cheered, but I could see in her face that the real victory wasn't in the applause, but in the quiet realization that she had finally been seen. The recognition of her service, her hardships, and her victories wasn't just a public spectacle, it was a personal triumph. It was the moment Emily Carter, once lost and invisible, finally understood that she wasn't just a casualty of war, but a hero in her own right. The years of being overlooked, dismissed, and ignored were now behind her. The world was finally giving her the recognition she deserved. As the ceremony continued, I couldn't help but think back to the alley, to the moment when Trump had stopped and spoken to her, when he had offered her a lifeline. It had been just the beginning, but now, standing before the world, she had become something more, a living testament to the strength of those who never give up, no matter the odds. She had endured the darkest of days, but now she was being celebrated for her resilience. And as she looked out at the crowd, I could see the flicker of hope in her eyes. Hope that had long since been extinguished, now reignited. Emily Carter was no longer a forgotten hero. Today, she was standing tall, recognized and honored for all that she had sacrificed and all that she had become. And then, Donald Trump made an announcement that would change everything. His voice echoed through the room, capturing the attention of every person present. "We are proud to announce the creation of the Bravo Company Foundation," he declared. "This foundation will serve to support veterans like Emily and her comrades, to make sure they receive the care and recognition they so deserve." The weight of his words was immediate. This wasn't just another symbolic gesture. It was a promise to the veterans who had been overlooked and forgotten for far too long. The foundation would offer real, meaningful support, not just in terms of healthcare or financial aid, but by ensuring veterans were seen, heard, and valued by the nation they fought for. I watched Emily as the announcement settled in. Her expression softened, the guarded look in her eyes replaced by something that resembled hope. The skepticism that had followed her through years of disappointment faded into the background. This wasn't just a public statement, it was a turning point. For the first time, there was a glimmer of hope on the horizon, not just for Emily, but for all veterans who had been left behind. The promise of the Bravo Company Foundation meant that their sacrifices would no longer go unnoticed, and that they would receive the care and respect they deserved. I saw Emily stand a little taller, the burden of feeling forgotten lifting from her shoulders. She had fought for recognition for so long, and now that recognition was finally coming. It was a moment that symbolized more than just the acknowledgement of one person. It was a step toward ensuring that no veteran would ever again feel abandoned or invisible. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind for Emily. She went from being an anonymous face in the crowd, someone overlooked by society, to being a powerful voice for veterans nationwide. Her transformation was nothing short of remarkable. She went from the cold streets of Brooklyn to stages, sharing her story with the world. She became an advocate, speaking up for the very people who had once been invisible, people who had sacrificed so much only to be forgotten in the shadows of the country they had served. I'll never forget the first time I saw her speak. The event was held in a small auditorium, the kind where the walls seemed to hold the weight of the people who had once walked through them. Emily was set to give her first public address as an advocate for veterans, and I could tell she was nervous. There was hesitation in her voice, a quiet fear that perhaps she might not be able to carry the weight of the words she needed to say. Her hands trembled slightly as she stepped up to the microphone, her eyes scanning the audience, uncertain of how her words would be received. But there was something in her that was different now. a quiet strength that had been forged from the years of hardship she had endured. As she began to speak, her voice wavered at first, uncertain of its own power. But as the words flowed, something in her shifted. Her confidence grew. With every sentence, her voice becoming steadier, more powerful. It was as if, with each word, she was reclaiming a piece of herself, taking back the years that had been stolen from her. She was no longer just the forgotten woman in the alley. She was a force, a woman who had found her voice and was using it to speak for those who couldn't. "I am not a hero," she said, her voice now clear and unwavering. "I am just a woman who was forgotten. But because of the support I received, I am here today to tell you that no veteran should ever feel like they don't matter." Her words hung in the air, and I could see the faces in the audience shift. They were no longer just listening, they were feeling, understanding. Emily wasn't glorifying her own struggles or seeking praise for herself. Instead, she was using her experience to speak on behalf of the countless veterans who had been left behind, ignored, and cast aside. Her humility was evident, but so was her strength. She continued, her voice now rising with purpose. "I may not be a hero, but I am living proof that we can change the way veterans are treated. We can do better, and we must. Every person who has served this country deserves to be seen, heard, and supported. No one should have to fight a war abroad and then come home to fight another one at home. One for dignity, for respect." The room was silent, hanging on every word. It was in that moment that I realized Emily had become more than just a speaker. She had become a symbol of resilience, of the power of being seen, of the importance of not letting anyone, no matter how forgotten they may feel, be left behind. By the time she finished, the audience was on their feet, applauding not just her words but the strength that radiated from her. Emily had turned her pain into a message, and in doing so, she had given a voice to so many who had been silenced for too long. And as the applause echoed through the room, I knew that this was only the beginning. Emily's journey was far from over. She was no longer the woman who had been forgotten. She was the woman leading a movement, reminding everyone that every veteran mattered, that no one should ever be made to feel invisible again. Months later, Emily found herself standing at the threshold of the National Veterans Honor Gala, a prestigious event held to honor the sacrifices of those who had served their country. It was a night for the nation's most influential figures, from lawmakers to military leaders, to come together and recognize the veterans who had given so much in service. The air inside the grand hall was thick with respect and admiration, and the polished, gold-trimmed walls seemed to shimmer with the weight of history. When Emily entered the hall, the room fell silent. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd, and all eyes turned toward her. The woman who had once been nothing more than a forgotten face on the streets of Brooklyn Heights was now standing in the very heart of the nation's recognition. Her journey from being homeless to becoming the voice of the voiceless had taken her to the highest stage for veterans. She was no longer the weary woman wrapped in layers of fabric trying to shield herself from the biting cold. She had been transformed into a symbol of strength, resilience, and the power of being seen. As she walked down the aisle toward the stage, there was a sense of awe in the room, as if the very air had shifted. Emily Carter, the once overlooked veteran, was now standing before the most powerful and influential figures in the nation, and she was ready to speak for every veteran whose story had been forgotten. When she reached the podium and took the microphone, a hush fell over the audience. You could feel the anticipation in the air, the weight of the moment. The woman who had once been invisible, whose life had been reduced to a cardboard sign on a cold Brooklyn street, now stood before the people who had the power to change the fate of so many veterans, just like her. The room was held in suspense as she took a steadying breath and began to speak. "I am not here to seek praise," she started, her voice firm but filled with humility. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she had experienced, everything she had fought for. "I am here to remind you that no veteran should ever feel forgotten." The crowd stood motionless, captivated. For a moment, the room felt timeless, filled with people who, in their own way, understood the sacrifices that Emily and so many others had made. But it wasn't just about her story anymore. It was about all the stories of veterans who had been left behind by the very society they had fought to protect. Emily's words struck a chord with everyone in the room. They weren't just a call to action, they were a demand for change. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every veteran who had slipped through the cracks, for every man and woman who had given their all and received nothing in return but silence. "I'm here to make sure that the veterans who have fought in every war, on every battlefield, and in every conflict are never again treated like they are invisible," she continued, her voice growing more resolute with each word. "We all have stories. We all have sacrifices. But too many of us have been forgotten by the very system that should be protecting us." Her gaze swept over the audience, and for the first time, I saw a shift in their expressions. They weren't just passive listeners, they were active participants in her story. Emily's message wasn't just reaching them, it was changing them. There were nods of agreement, a few quiet exchanges between the most powerful figures in the room. It was clear that this was no longer just a speech. It was the beginning of a movement, the start of a national conversation about how veterans were treated in America. As she finished her speech, the room erupted in applause, this time not just out of politeness, but from a deep collective recognition of what Emily had accomplished. She had come from the depths of neglect and despair, and now she was leading the charge to ensure that no veteran would ever again feel the sting of being forgotten. Her words were more than a plea. They were a challenge to the nation to do better, to do right by the men and women who had served in silence for too long. As the applause washed over her, Emily stood tall, no longer the forgotten woman in an alley, but a leader, a voice for every veteran whose story had yet to be told. The National Veterans Honor Gala had witnessed the transformation of a life, but more than that, it had witnessed the birth of a movement that would forever change the way veterans were seen, heard, and honored. Trump's promise to veterans didn't stop with a speech or an announcement. It grew into something tangible, something that would change the lives of thousands. He launched the Veterans Assistance Fund, a comprehensive initiative designed to provide long-term support for veterans who had been left behind by the system. Emily played a pivotal role in shaping and driving the fund's vision. Having once been forgotten herself, she brought a unique perspective, understanding the gaps and the struggles that veterans faced in their daily lives. With the foundation of the Veterans Assistance Fund, Emily helped create a vast network of resources to serve veterans in need. From housing assistance to healthcare, education, and career training, the fund aimed to provide a holistic support system. No longer would veterans be left to navigate the complexities of civilian life alone. The network offered critical resources designed to help them rebuild and regain their sense of dignity and purpose. Emily worked tirelessly to ensure the network addressed not just immediate needs, but long-term solutions, helping veterans find steady employment, access mental health services, and secure permanent housing. Emily knew firsthand how difficult it was to find help, how easy it was to fall through the cracks, and how disheartening it could feel to be invisible. So she made sure that no veteran would have to experience that again. She poured her heart into making sure the program was accessible, compassionate, and comprehensive. She visited veterans across the country, gathering input and working alongside other former service members to fine-tune the support they offered. The initiative wasn't just a bureaucratic solution. It was a community effort, one built on understanding and a shared desire to give back to those who had given so much. As the Veterans Assistance Fund grew, so did its impact. More and more veterans came forward, many for the first time, ready to share their stories and receive the support they so desperately needed. The fund became a lifeline for those struggling with homelessness, mental health issues, addiction, and unemployment. What had started as a quiet promise from Donald Trump had now transformed into a national movement, offering practical support and hope to the very people who had sacrificed their lives for the country. Veterans who had once felt forgotten, isolated, or even ashamed of their struggles were now finding a community that valued them. For many, it was more than just resources. It was a sense of belonging. They were no longer fighting alone. They had a network of people who understood their pain and were willing to help them heal. The impact rippled out across the nation as veterans began to reclaim their lives and futures. Stories that had been silenced for years were now being told, and the support they received was helping them heal, find purpose, and rebuild their identities. Emily, standing at the center of this movement, continued to advocate for veterans with the same passion and drive she had when she first shared her story. Her voice, once timid and uncertain, had grown into one that was powerful, unwavering, and full of conviction. As the initiative expanded, Emily's work became a testament to the resilience of veterans and the power of support, proving that no matter how forgotten someone might feel, it's never too late to be seen and to make a difference. The Veterans Assistance Fund not only provided essential services, but it also sparked a broader conversation about how America treats its veterans. The program brought to light the issues many had been reluctant to acknowledge, from inadequate health care to the lack of long-term care options. The initiative didn't just help veterans, it changed the national dialogue, forcing policymakers to confront the ways in which they had failed those who had fought to defend their country. With Emily's leadership and Trump's unwavering commitment, the Veterans Assistance Fund became a model for how government and communities could come together to support those who had served. The fund wasn't just about fixing a broken system. It was about rebuilding a relationship, about ensuring that the men and women who had given so much would no longer feel invisible or alone. Looking back, I realized how much Emily's story had truly transformed not only her own life, but the lives of countless others. In a world often focused on the present, her journey became a reminder of the power of perseverance and hope. She wasn't just a symbol of resilience, she had become a force for change, a living testament to the idea that no matter how dark or forgotten someone's past might seem, there is always the possibility of a brighter future. Emily's story was proof that the human spirit could rise above adversity, find purpose again, and, in turn, inspire others to do the same. Her impact wasn't confined to the speeches or the medals she had received. It resonated in the very fabric of the communities she had touched. She had become a beacon of possibility for anyone who had ever felt lost, overlooked, or abandoned. Through her actions and her unwavering commitment to veterans, Emily showed the world that anyone could make a difference, regardless of the scars they carried or the challenges they had faced. She wasn't just changing lives, she was redefining what it meant to be a hero. Years after that fateful day in the alley, when President Trump had first stopped to speak to her, Emily's legacy continued to live on, not just in the stories she told or the recognition she received, but through the very foundation she had helped to create. The Veterans Assistance Fund, which had once been a promise made in the midst of an unexpected encounter, had grown into a nationwide movement that was making a tangible difference in the lives of veterans. What started as a lifeline for a single individual had expanded to support thousands, ensuring that veterans would never again be treated as invisible. The foundation wasn't just about providing resources, it was about restoring dignity to those who had served. Emily's work had paved the way for a future where veterans could access the care, support, and recognition they so deserved. The legacy of the Veterans Assistance Fund lived in every home that was stabilized, every career that was rebuilt, and every life that was transformed by the resources she had helped create. More than just the tangible changes, Emily's promise had become something greater. She had promised to herself and to every veteran that they would never be forgotten again. And she had kept that promise. Through her tireless advocacy, through every conversation and every event, she had ensured that the stories of veterans, those who had sacrificed everything, would never again fade into the background of society. They would be heard, they would be seen, and most importantly, they would be valued. Even after her public speeches had ended and her days of being in the spotlight had waned, Emily's influence continued to grow. Her story was shared in classrooms, in support groups, and in homes across the country. Her life had become a living lesson in resilience, in the importance of community, and in the strength of the human spirit. Emily showed the world that no matter how hard the past may be, no matter how deep the wounds, there is always the potential for healing, for growth, and for redemption. Her work inspired a new generation of advocates, volunteers, and leaders who were committed to carrying forward the mission of the Veterans Assistance Fund and ensuring that no veteran would ever feel forgotten again. Emily had sparked a movement, and that movement continued to flourish, growing stronger with each passing year. She had proven that one person's determination could create ripples of change that would echo across time, far beyond the alley where she had once been forgotten. As I reflected on her journey, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Emily had never sought fame or recognition. She had simply wanted to be seen, to be valued, and in the end, that's exactly what she had become. Not just a voice for veterans, but a symbol of hope, of healing, and of the incredible power that lies within each of us to make a difference. Emily's story was more than just one woman's journey from the streets to the stage. It was a powerful reminder to all of us that heroes come in many forms. Her transformation wasn't just a personal victory. It was a reflection of the untold stories of so many others who had been overlooked, whose sacrifices and struggles had been buried under the weight of time. Emily embodied the idea that heroism isn't always flashy or easy to recognize. Some heroes wear medals on their chests, others wear scars. Emotional, physical, or both. But the one thing all heroes share, regardless of their appearance or their past, is the inherent need to be seen. And when someone finally takes the time to look, to truly see them, everything changes. Her story had the power to change perspectives, to reshape the way we view those who have served, those who have fallen through the cracks of society, and those who have quietly endured. When Emily first stepped onto the stage, she was no longer the woman hunched over in the cold streets of Brooklyn Heights. She was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the strength of the human spirit. She was a living example that no matter how broken or forgotten someone may seem, they still have the power to rise, to heal, and to make a difference. She proved that even the most difficult journeys can lead to powerful, life-changing outcomes. The streets may have been where Emily started, but they would never define her. Those streets had been a place of survival, of hardship, but they were not where her story ended. They were simply a chapter, one that would eventually lead to a much larger narrative of redemption, advocacy, and transformation. Her journey was one of strength, not just physical strength, but a deeper resilience that came from within. It was about refusing to be forgotten, about standing up for herself and for others, and about giving voice to the silenced. Emily was not just fighting for her own future. She was fighting for every veteran, every person who had felt discarded by society, to ensure they would no longer be invisible. Through her work, Emily made sure that no veteran, no matter how far removed from the public eye, would ever feel forgotten again. The foundation she helped create was more than just a safety net. It was a declaration that those who had given everything in service to their country would no longer be left behind. She had become a voice for the voiceless, advocating for those who had faced neglect and hardship after their time in the military. Her platform wasn't just about recognition. It was about ensuring that the needs of veterans were met, that they were treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. Emily had turned her pain into purpose, using her own journey to bring light to the struggles of others. Her strength came from a deep understanding of what it meant to be forgotten, but it also came from an unshakable belief in the power of change. Emily knew firsthand that transformation was possible, not only for individuals, but for entire systems. She had witnessed it in her own life, from the forgotten woman in the alley to the honored guest on stage at the National Veterans Honor Gala. But what made Emily's transformation so extraordinary wasn't just her rise from hardship, it was her unwavering commitment to ensuring that others could have the same opportunity. Through her advocacy, Emily created a ripple effect that reached across the nation. She proved that heroism isn't just about the accolades or the titles. It's about the courage to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, the willingness to fight for the overlooked, and the strength to keep going even when the world has turned its back on you. Emily's legacy lived on, not just in the words she spoke, but in the lives she touched, the veterans she helped, and the message she sent to the world, that heroes come in many forms, and they all deserve to be seen, heard, and celebrated. In the end, Emily's story became a call to action, a reminder to all of us that no matter where we start, no matter the struggles we face, we all have the potential to rise, to make a difference, and to leave a legacy of change. Her journey wasn't just her own, it was a collective journey for all those who had been forgotten and for all those who would rise alongside her. She had become a living testament to the fact that with strength, resilience, and a little help along the way, anyone can overcome their past and rewrite their future. How would you react if you saw Donald Trump stop to help a homeless veteran on a cold Brooklyn street? This story took an unexpected turn, and it might just change the way you think about second chances. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to William's Wisdom Stories for more powerful tales of compassion and courage.